I gave a talk in 2017 for the Esoteric Quest's conference in the Outer Hebrides, in which I explored the diversity of extrasensory perception covered by the Scottish term second sight, especially as it began to be researched and written about in the 17th century. Spirits wrapped in a variety of shroud formations, parading candles foretelling of future calamity. Phenomena so supernatural, so weird, that it threatened the foundations of traditional religion and material science alike. In this talk, however, I'm going to focus on the weirdest phenomenon of all associated with second sight and most often identified with it, including by scholars, such as historian Michael Hunter: the uncanny ability of certain individuals to foresee future events. This uncanny ability, also known as precognition, formed half of Samuel Johnson's dictionary entry on second sight. The other half, seeing things distant, that is, in present time but way beyond our visual field, may well be, as we will later consider, an offshoot of the same ability. An ability that Johnson, 20 years after he published his dictionary and had actually researched second sight in Scotland, defined more precisely as an impression by which things distant or future are perceived and seen as if they were present. This receptive faculty, for power it cannot be called, is neither voluntary nor constant. The appearances have no dependence upon choice. They cannot be summoned, detained, or recalled. Demoting second sight from a reliably commandable power to a fickle faculty is perhaps the first step we need to take to diminish its weirdness. Or at any rate, the less commandable on demand second sight appears to be, the less weird also. The very word weird, in fact, derived from the Old English word weird, spelled with a Y, meaning fate, only took on its present sense of eerie when it became associated with a reliable ritual power to summon fate, Macbeth's weird sisters, based on Norns in Norse mythology, who possessed not merely an inconstant receptive faculty, but a reliable power to, in Shakespeare's phrase, look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not. We will see in a moment some Celtic divination practices that also attempted such summoning, but none to match the reliable weird power in double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Macbeth, of course, was a real person, the last Celtic king whose death in 1057 marked the beginning of the influence of Saxon England on Scotland, and the demise of Celtic traditions and Druidic practices, which had included ritualistic divination. Indeed, as Miranda Green, an archaeology professor at Cardiff University, put it, the importance of the Druids in divination cannot be overestimated. In both classical and insular sources, they are recorded as being not only priests, but also prophets. Druid Celtic prophecy, or divination, came in a variety of forms, such as reading the message in thrown sticks etched with the Ogham alphabet, or in clouds, or the scapula bones of sheep, along with various induced darkness methods, such as Imbas Ferozna, enlightened manifestation, in which the would-be seer entered a completely dark place, usually a cave, and after several hours, or sometimes days alone, would emerge into the sunlight and, just like the freed prisoners in Plato's cave allegory, would be dazzled by the sudden brightness, and in that bedazzled state would answer questions about the future. Another divination practice was free, spelled F-R-I-T-H, meaning to find. in which the seer would, after fasting, stand barefooted and blindfolded in a doorway and make a prediction based on the first thing he or she saw when the blindfolds came off. And then there was Tarb Face, literally bull feast, in which the seer would first drink broth made from a sacrificed bull and then wear the bull's hide to induce a prophetic trance in his sleep. But even without the heavy pajamas, sleep incubation in darkened chambers and caves was one of the most prominent forms of Druid divination practice. Such is what likely transpired in the first Druid habitation ever found, the Glimmerton Cave in Edinburgh. Sleep incubation in caves was also widespread at the same time in ancient Greece, including, as the great esoteric-oriented Greek scholar Peter Kingsley has emphasized, a state of awareness between waking and sleep, dreamless or otherwise, transcending time and space, a state which Kingsley identifies explicitly with Indian samadhi, a stillness that has the power to carry a human being into another reality, into a world of prophecy, where future and past and present are all contained. And we will be checking in with Peter throughout this talk. While Druid and Greek divination sleep incubation are traditionally believed to have sprung up independently from each other, recent archaeologically based reconstructions of Celtic origins indicate far more intermingling than had been traditionally believed. Instead of seeing Celtic migration as primarily from east to west, it is now believed to have progressed along the Atlantic facade. And of course, the Celts had invaded Greece in the 3rd century BCE, a lasting monument of which is this stunning sculpture of a Celtic warrior known as the Dying Gaul. The Celts were decisively defeated at Delphi. Two cultures, steeped in divination, battling it out on the prime divination ground of one of them. We'll return to Delphi. Part of making weird, W-Y-R-D, less W-E-I-R-D, is acknowledging how widespread a belief it was. One guide to such acknowledgement, whom we will also be checking in with throughout this talk, is William James. As the father of transpersonal psychology, founder of the American Society for Psychical Research, and author of the classic and still widely popular book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James knew well that the capacity to see the future deserved serious consideration, if for no other reason than, despite its paradoxical absurdities, it is found lying broadcast over the surface of history. We'll be tuning in Second Sight broadcasts from around the world, but for now, we'll continue with the only country in which Second Sight has been part of its national identity, for millennia no less, up to and including our own, as was confirmed by scholar Shari Cohn, whose turn-of-the-century PhD thesis was entitled The Scottish Tradition of Second Sight and Other Psychic Experiences in Families. Her data, published in numerous journals and collected from the whole of Scotland, dispelled the myth that Second Sight was predominantly a Highland and Island experience that has now vanished. Earnest research of Second Sight began in the 17th century, ignited by the interest of what Samuel Johnson called the literate lowland Anglo-Saxon culture, in contrast to the oral culture of the Highland and Island Celts. The two most renowned so-called literate culture representatives drawn to Second Sight, other than Samuel Johnson, were the chemist Robert Boyle and the diarist and Secretary of the Admiralty Samuel Pepys. The most popular accounting of Second Sight was in Martin Martin's A Description of the Western Islands of Scotland, in which he tried to establish the simple sincerity of Second Sight seers, writing, "The seers are generally illiterate and well-meaning people, and altogether void of design. nor could I ever learn that any of them made the least gain by it. Samuel Johnson was given this book as a child and carried it with him on his trek through Scotland that culminated in his book, which we previously mentioned, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, in which he proclaimed, "We should have had little claim to the praise of curiosity if we had not endeavored with particular attention to examine the question of second sight." The church response to second sight was mixed. On the one hand, the expansion of Protestantism in the 17th century was fueled in part by the characterization of all occult-like phenomena, from ghosts to second sight, as demonic, and conveniently linked to the weird supernatural excesses of Catholicism. The anti-Catholic King James of Scotland, and later as well of England, who directly participated in the persecution of witches, researched and wrote a book on them in particular and occult powers in general, declaring phenomena such as second sight an illusion rifest in the time of papistry. On the other hand, second sight, as scholar Elsa Richardson put it, could provide particularly compelling evidence for the claims of natural theology. Indeed, she writes, second sight co-opted into a wider epistemology that explicated preternatural happenings as the further evidence of God's omnipresence. The first three of these books were written by Protestant ministers in the 17th and early 18th centuries, while Father Allen, a main second sight source for the Society of Psychical Research in the latter part of the 19th century, was a Catholic priest in the Outer Hebrides. The Reverend William MacLeod, whose treatise on second sight, published under the pseudonym Theosophilus Insulanus, you see there next to Father Allen, spoke to both Protestants and Catholics alike when he wrote, "The manifested power of God is manifestly concerned in all these communications, which rouse and establish his faith to believe that the soul of man is spiritual and immortal." Relating second sight to God was not, of course, a new idea. As I wrote in my book, The Illusion of Will, Self, and Time, the Judeo-Christian tradition was built on prophecy. The scroll form of bookmaking, in fact, evolved into our present-day form of cut pages in order to facilitate the checking of prophecies in the Old Testament against events in the New. And 15 of the dreams recorded in the Bible consist of precognitive prophecy. Of all the miracles in the Bible, nothing is more miraculous than such prophecies, with their suggestion that the future can be seen, not simply guessed at or imagined. Even when divinely caused disaster is believed to have occurred, as when the handwriting on the wall appeared at a feast to the enemy of the Jews, Belshazzar, God's power, as Jack Miles pointed out, is proven less by the fact that Belshazzar is defeated than by the fact that the defeat was predicted. And then there was Jesus' second sight prowess with Peter, depicted here by the Spanish painter Ribera, in the moment when Peter realized the fulfillment of Jesus' prevision. "Before the cock crows, thou shalt deny me thrice." A specific amount of denials in a specific time frame. I don't think we're meant to believe that Jesus was guessing. And given the ubiquity of second sight, Jesus' miraculous prowess here is exempt from James's complaint about credulous Bible readers. How could people ever have taken paltry miracles as the cornerstone of the whole system? God's credentials, forsooth. Bah! As it turns out, second sight can function as a cornerstone of a divine belief system. Nothing quite inspires divine awe like second sight in any religion. For instance, when a senior disciple of the renowned Hindu holy man Ramakrishna was asked, "How do you know your guru is authentic?" he replied, "If for no other reason than this. Whatever he said came true. His words of prophecy have all been fulfilled." Even a godless religion, such as Buddhism, accommodates second sight. According to the Dalai Lama, the trance-induced Tibetan state oracle on many occasions gave him very specific answers to questions he posed to him, and they always turned out to be correct. And it was her accurate prediction of a specific reversal of a battle that launched the career of Joan of Arc from peasant to commander of the French army, with other specific predictions by her fulfilled as well, all of them she claimed to have come from God via angels. For many today, of course, identifying second sight as a manifest power of God only doubles its weirdness, as it doubles the challenge to the prevailing worldview, scientific materialism. But, as one of the pioneers of that worldview, Robert Boyle, admonished, the method of God's conduct is a far nobler object for our contemplation than the laws according to which the parts of matter hit against and jostle one another, and the effects or results of such motions. Therefore, he continued, any one relation of a supernatural phenomenon being fully proved and duly verified suffices to evince the thing contended for, and, consequently, to invalidate some of the atheists' plausiblest arguments. But Boyle, who almost single-handedly pulled up the roots of alchemical chemistry and replaced them with what we now know as the science of chemistry, had a formidable challenge in defending second sight, the Royal Society in London, of which he was a founding fellow, founded to demystify the natural world through experiments and careful observation. Its motto, nullius in verba, literally on the word of no one, made it clear that someone's word alone could never constitute fully proved and duly verified, which therefore proved a significant challenge for so supernatural phenomenon as second sight, since all proofs at that time were limited to the anecdotal, even though some of that anecdotal, in Scotland at least, was the shared direct experience and testimony of an entire congregation of people. Such as occurred in 1685 on the Isle of Eigg in the Outer Hebrides, when a congregation had their Sunday sermon interrupted by a seer who warned them in specific and unusual detail of an invasion on their island, an invasion that transpired 4 years later, 2 weeks after the seer died, in the precise details that he had foretold. I will be sharing later in this talk another group witnessing of an apparent second sight that, due to modern technology, transcends the anecdotal. So I'll not, as I did in my previous talk, elaborate on this striking group anecdote here. But since most of the second sight broadcasts over the surface of history are anecdotal, we do well to heed Professor of Religion Jeffrey Kripal's dictum that anecdotal is a perfectly accurate descriptor of another word, evidence. Boyle himself, aware that anecdotal, nonetheless, did not meet the Royal Society's standard of fully proved and duly verified, settled for what he called the main circumstances of second sight to be impartially delivered and sufficiently verified. His most renowned example meeting that test is a letter he received from George Mackenzie, aka Lord Tarbat, which read as follows. In January 1652, Colonel Alex Monroe and I happened to be in the house of one William McClend of Ferrenlea, in the county of Ross. He, the landlord, and I were sitting in 3 chairs near the fire, and in the corner of the great chimney there were 2 islanders, who were that very night come to the house, and were related to the landlord. While the one of them was talking with Monroe, I perceived the other to look oddly toward me. From this look, and his being an islander, I conjectured him a seer, and asked him at what he stared. He answered by desiring me to rise from that chair, for it was an unlucky one. I asked him why. He answered, because there was a dead man in the chair next to me. Well, said I, if it be in the next chair, I may keep my own. But what is the likeness of the man? He said he was a tall man, with a long grey coat, booted, and one of his legs hanging over the arm of the chair, and his head hanging dead to the other side, and his arm backward, as if it was broken. There were some English troops quartered near that place at that time, and it was a great frost after a thaw, so that the country was covered all over with ice. 4 or 5 of the English rode by this house some 2 hours after the vision, while we were sitting by the fire. We heard a great noise, and it proved to be those troopers, who, with the help of other servants, carried in one of them, who had fallen badly, and had his arm broke. He also often fell into swooning fits. They brought him into the hall, and set him in the very chair, and in the very posture that the seer had talked of. But the man did not die, he recovered, although with great difficulty. Anecdotes such as these are only, of course, as trustworthy as those relating them. Tarbat here being one of 2 lords I will be evoking in this talk, and not to overtax your trust in 17th century wig wearers. The great linguistic scholar George Hicks is noteworthy for his claim about second sight. When I was in Scotland, I never met with any learned man, either among the divines or lawyers, who doubted of the thing. Also noteworthy is John Aubrey. A historian and proto-archaeologist, he was the discoverer of the Avebury Henge, and one of the first to correct the misidentification of Stonehenge with the Romans, rather than, as with Avebury, the Celts and Druids, a controversial and revolutionary claim in its day. He would also seem to be a decent vetter of character, being the author of a highly popular and still widely read biographical anthology, The Brief Lives, including such figures as Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, Thomas Brown, John Dee, Sir Walter Raleigh, Ben Jonson, Thomas Hobbes, and William Shakespeare. So one might give him some credit as an able assembler of credible second sight anecdotes, able to identify who was and was not, as he wrote, a very honest man and of right blameless conversation. But anyone, alas, communicating second sight as plausible, from ancient times to our own day, imperils their credibility. A century after Aubrey died, the renowned Chalmers Biographical Dictionary identified him as a man of excellent capacity and indefatigable application, a diligent searcher into antiquities, a good Latin poet, an excellent naturalist, but somewhat credulous and tinctured with superstition. And tinctured with superstition was mild censure compared to the ridicule Aubrey's and his contemporaries' second sight research received in their own time, especially with the rise in the 17th and 18th centuries of coffeehouse culture. The absence of alcohol created an atmosphere in which it was possible to engage in more serious conversation. But, like an internet chat room, more serious does not entail more balanced. Take Samuel Johnson, for instance. His request for an open mind in examining second sight could not survive the disdaining din of the coffee houses. As the journal The Satirist summarized the reaction to Johnson's research, few of his eccentricities have excited so much ridicule as his defense of Scottish second sight, a gift that has always been considered by every well-bred Englishman as a proof only of the ignorance and vanity of the Caledonians. Boyle summarized it this way: "We live in an age and a place wherein all stories of witchcrafts or other magical feats are by many, even of the wise, suspected, and by too many that would pass for wits, derided and exploded." This culture of ridicule, according to historian Michael Hunter, had a chilling effect on second sight research, and it is a culture that has prevailed to this day. What William James wrote in a 1903 letter to the Nation magazine could have been written at any time in the last 300 years. Psychical research is a dog with so few friends at court that almost any stick is good enough to beat him with. As we shall see, nothing much has changed since James's time, and coffeehouse culture prevails, especially amongst the tireless organized debunkers on Wikipedia, the so-called guerrilla skeptics, not to be confused with good faith skeptics. Which is not to say that Wikipedia must be avoided as a starting point for psychical research. Just don't stop there. This is true for psychical research derived both from mostly obscure labs and renowned lives, such as Scotland's own 17th century Brahan Seer, Konyak Odar, or the Bulgarian mystic Baba Vanga, or last but far from least, Nostradamus. I covered them in my last talk, so I won't dwell on them here. A quick word about Nostradamus, though. The highly specific prophecies related to his home country of France, especially the jaw-droppingly detailed rise and fall of Napoleon, constitute most of what historian Jeffrey Ash has called the A-list, and best justify Nostradamus' status as the most preeminent of all second-sighted seers. But surely weird. We'll get to some of the most recent psychical research on second sight and precognition, but in our quest to make second sight less weird, we need to briefly visit that bedrock of Western civilization other than Christianity, ancient Greece. Greece was home to their own three sisters of fate, whose power over destiny exceeded Zeus himself, though there are passages here and there that challenge that hegemony. Nonetheless, it is clear that for Western civilization, WYRD did not start out as a WEIRD concept. And there is also, of course, the god Apollo, god of prophecy and oracles, presiding god of the oracle at Delphi, frequently depicted as here with his bow and arrows. Arrows which the esoteric classicist Peter Kingsley associates with the Tibetan Phurba, seen here on the cover of his book, A Story Waiting to Pierce You, in front of the Mongolian Tibetan landscape, from which Peter believes the shamanic missionary Abaris, mentioned by several ancient authors, brought a Phurba from Mongolia, infused with Apollo-like prophetic prowess, to Pythagoras, whom we are told by Clement of Alexandria always applied his mind to divination. Classicist Jan Bremer pushed back against the Mongolian-Tibetan connection, arguing that Abaris is identified, and identified repeatedly, as coming only from Hyperborea, literally beyond the north wind, a blessed utopia most often imagined as a temperate version of the North Pole. This homeland for Abaris is supported by his migration always being described as south, not west. But I believe Peter overall makes a good, detailed case for linking Abaris with the pre-Buddhist Tibetan monks, whose second sight shamanism is still intact today. You remember this guy, the Tibetan state oracle who fled with the Dalai Lama to Dharmasala. A face of such joyful serenity is worth bringing back. Here is today's state oracle in full trance mode, reminding us that, in Tibet at least, as Tibetan scholar Jeffrey Smith affirms, Tibetan Buddhist doctrines can be seen as partial and limited approaches to the truth of the shamanic vision. At any rate, it seems evident that shamanism, whether arriving from due north or northwest of Greece, played a part in bringing second sight to Pythagoras. As Kingsley notes in his groundbreaking book, Ancient Philosophy, Mystery, and Magic, Pythagoras was a collector of traditions. That is how it is presented to us in the earliest sources. And E.R. Dodds, in his earlier groundbreaking book, The Greeks and the Irrational, emphasizes that later tradition brought Pythagoras into contact with the northerner Abaris, credited him with the usual shamanistic powers of prophecy. Dodds, by the way, was a president of the Society for Psychical Research, and in 1971 he published an essay entitled Supernormal Phenomena in Classical Antiquity. Shortly before his death in 1971, after he had retired from Oxford, when he was visited by two young Greek scholars, he told them, "I have no interest anymore in Greek religion. I am only interested in paranormal phenomena." A less surprising evolution when you consider that in his youth he was expelled from Campbell College in Ireland for what was officially deemed gross study and sustained insolence. Three qualities, I believe, that served him well in his evolution to one of the foremost Western scholar guides of second sight. One of the key elements of which, he emphasized, was not just seeing forward, but backward as well. For the ancient Greeks, he tells us, divination, mantike, referred to both precognition and retrocognition, the typical diviner being Homer's Calchas, who knew things past, present, and to come, and that the most celebrated seers would sometimes exhibit supernormal knowledge of past events as evidence that their vision of the future will prove true. Schopenhauer called such supernormal knowledge reverse second sight. Stephen Schwartz, a former editor at National Geographic, is perhaps our leading researcher of retrocognition. But the most renowned and certainly vetted exemplar of this retro capacity is the Polish-Russian chemist psychic Stefan Osowicki. The early 20th century accounts of how Osowicki did not just see the past, but seemed to inhabit it, as if he were physically present in it, echo the account of another clairvoyant, rigorously investigated by William James and the Psychical Society. The vivid details of this case are worth sharing, as it is precisely this vividness that aligns it with other accounts of reverse second sight broadcast throughout history. In the fall of 1898, a New Hampshire woman, Nellie Titus, had what she felt was a premonition of a disaster, followed soon after by a sense that it had transpired. Hours later, when a young woman who worked in a local mill was reported missing, Titus immediately guessed correctly that the woman would be found drowned. Although prone to trances, she tried to avoid them because they usually made her ill for some time after. Nonetheless, she fell into several trances later that day in which she appeared to inhabit the scene of the drowning as it unfolded. She inhabited the scene so thoroughly while entranced that her husband was able to question her on the incident and get answers, but could not get her to respond to anything not related to the scene. She even shivered with cold as the early winter morning scene unfolded. Titus neither knew the woman nor had been near the area where the incident occurred, but she saw in her trance the woman walking on a bridge and then slip off at a specific spot. In another trance, she saw the body of the woman, head down, only 1 foot with a new rubber showing, and lying in a deep hole. A professional diver from Boston, Brian Sullivan, was hired by the mill owner to search the river. 2 days after Titus's trances, in the one and only chance she was given to guide that diver, she pointed to the exact spot the body could be found and how it would be positioned. Sullivan, who had just concluded a thorough search of the area and found nothing, was highly skeptical and reluctant to search again. But at the urging of the mill owner, he relented. As he later told the Psychical Research Investigating Committee, "I started down the ladder, which extended about 5 feet under the water. When I swung off the ladder, I went sideways and then turned. As I struck the cribwork, 10 feet below the ladder, I turned to face the ladder, and my hand struck something. I felt of it, and it felt like a foot. I stopped short where I was. It is my business to recover bodies in the water, and I am not afraid of them. But in this instance, I was afraid of the woman on the bridge." I thought to myself, how can any woman come from 4 miles away and tell me or any other man where I would find this body. I investigated and felt of her foot and made sure that it was a body. She was lying in a deep hole, head down. It was so dark that I could not see anything. I had to feel entirely. When Sullivan was asked by the mill owner what he thought of it, he replied, "I did not think." I was stunned. As Sullivan testified to the committee, she located the place where I was to go down. She told me that the body was lying, head in a deep hole, with one foot sticking up, with a new rubber. I was down in about 18 feet of water. It was so dark, nobody could see anything down there. James published the committee investigation, including cross-examinations of the various people involved, in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, concluding that Titus's apparent witnessing in precise detail of a past event she had not been present for was a supernormal faculty of seership, whatever preciser meaning may later come to be attached to such phrase. And such supernormal faculty of seership, of retrocognition, reverse second sight, is what first drew James to the medium Leonora Piper, perhaps the most rigorously researched medium of all time, whom James called his white crow, as in, to disprove all crows are black, or all mediums are fake, you only need to find one white crow, or one real medium. In James's first session with the entranced Piper, he writes, "She told of my killing a gray and white cat with ether, and described how it had spun round and round before dying. She told how the crib creaked at night, how a certain rocking chair creaked mysteriously, how my wife had heard footsteps on a stair, etc., etc. Insignificant as these things sound when read, the accumulation of them has an irresistible effect." Weird, right? Not the stuff of our contemporary psychology. But that omission is itself weird because transmediumship was featured in what remains to this day the most widely read textbook in psychology, James's 1890 classic, The Principles of Psychology, in which he declared the serious study of trance phenomena to be, quote, one of the greatest needs of psychology, albeit a topic which, quote, the soi-disant, self-styled scientist usually refuses to explore. Unlike James, second sight debunking self-styled scientists, and by self-styled here I mean scientists in fields unrelated to second sight research posing as qualified scientists of it, are only posing as masters of truth. Returning now, though, to the origins of Western civilization and their masters of truth, we find it, as the eminent classicist Marcel Detienne, in agreement with Dodds, tells us, in those through whom the religious power of memory, mnemosune, both poet and diviner, have direct access to the beyond. They can see what is invisible and declare what has been, what is, and what will be. Detienne identifies them as poets and diviners. But of course the early so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, such as Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Empedocles, only wrote in verse. As did that master of masters, Pythagoras, of whom it was said by Empedocles, whenever he reached out with all his thinking organs, easily saw each of all the things which are in 10 or 20 human lifetimes. And Pythagoras' disciple, Parmenides, we now know through Peter Kingsley's research to have been an iatromantis, a healing priest of Apollo, as well as a pholarkos, or cave leader, who derived both healings and second sight prophecies by supervising ecstatic incubations. As Kingsley put it, what he calls Apollo's ecstasy happened in such stillness that anyone else might hardly notice it, or could easily mistake it for something else. But in this total stillness, there was total freedom from space and time. It's stillness that has the power to carry a human being into another reality, into a world of prophecy where future and past and present are all contained. I leave it to you to decide whether it is more weird or less weird that such incubation strongly evokes the 20th century mystic prophet healer Edgar Cayce. But do join me in the second sight song of Parmenides. Ude poden udestai, ape nun estin hamupan, hen sunekes. Ude poden udestai, ape nun estin hamupan, hen sunekes. Nor ever was it, nor will it be, since now it is, together all one, continuous. Oxford professor of religions, R.C. Zahner, says that culminating word, sunekes, literally holding together, here corresponds almost exactly to samadhi. Moving on to the masters of truth of our modern era, we could also call this the Song of Einstein. Since Parmenides was Karl Popper's, one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers of science, unresisted nickname for Einstein. Einstein's renowned echo of Parmenides' second sight song is, for us believing physicists, this separation between past, present, and future is an illusion, however stubborn. To help relax that stubbornness, Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist Roger Penrose formulated what is known as the Andromeda paradox, illustrated here in this delightful cartoon. One of the conditions for Newton's absolute even-flowing time of past, present, future is that at any given present moment now, two people who are next to each other in space can be considered simultaneous with everything else in the universe at their exact same moment together. But special relativity proved this to be not the case, as illustrated here with a violinist, a car driver, and a galaxy 2.5 million light years away. A driver in a car moving past a stationary person will have a different set of things that are simultaneous with that stationary person. At the distance of the Andromeda galaxy, the present instant for the stationary person might contain a meeting where a space admiral is deciding whether to invade Earth. In the present instant for the person in the car, the Andromeda fleet is already on the way. If there is no absolute simultaneity, no present absolutely separated from past and present, then there are only relative pasts and futures as well, no matter how stubborn the illusion of one absolute flowing time. Or as the distinguished philosopher of science Vasilij Petkov put it, only the block universe view does not contradict the experimental evidence which supports special relativity. Einstein asserted the primacy of the block universe in a famous debate about time with Bergson a century ago, April 6, 1922 to be precise in relative time. Einstein asserted both that the time of the philosophers does not exist and that there remains only a psychological time that differs from the physicists. Einstein's generally agreed defeat of Bergson in this debate may well have, as Canales asserts, represented a victory of scientific rationality over subjective intuition. But it clearly also represented a victory for at least one kind of intuition, second sight, especially a specific meaning of intuition as noted by the Oxford English Dictionary, immediate knowledge ascribed to spiritual beings with whom visions and knowledge are identical. Although both Einstein and Bergson found the evidence for telepathic intuition compelling, Bergson, as William Barnard duly noted, would have difficulty explaining or even acknowledging precognition. On the one hand, Bergson's inability to account for precognition reveals a fundamental flaw in his theorizing. As his contemporary, the Indian sage Sri Aurobindo put it, Bergson sees consciousness not in its essential truth, but as a sort of transcendent life energy descending into matter and acting there. On the other hand, Bergson's difficulty in acknowledging precognition, perhaps shared by all who hold to the absolute reality of time flow, would have been increasingly difficult for him to maintain in light of his wide openness to psychical research. Bergson was a president of the British Society for Psychical Research. Specifically, the precognition research that began in earnest less than a decade after his debate with Einstein. In 1930, J.B. and Louisa Rhine began 3 decades of positive precognition clinical trials at Duke University, mostly using picture cards, matched by 3 decades of precognition research by Robert John at Princeton, using more sophisticated equipment, such as a random mechanical cascade. Notice that John uses the neutral word for weird in naming their laboratory Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. Other prominent academic precognition researchers with serious science credentials include Charles Tart, who worked with the Rhines and later continued second sight research as a tenured professor at the University of California, Dean Radin of Bell Labs, the University of Las Vegas, and the Noetic Society, Dick Bierman of the University of Amsterdam, and Darrell Bem of Cornell University. But of course, no matter how impressive these university studies appear to be, James's dictum about psychical research being a dog with so few friends at court that almost any stick seems good enough to beat him with has pretty much held true. For every science-based researcher who believes with James that psychical research has broken down the limits of the admitted order of things, and that science, so far as science denies such exceptional occurrences, lies prostrate in the dust, there are dozens of more scientists of the kind James repeatedly attacked, or rather counterattacked throughout his career. Those with what he called conservative views, and no expertise outside their specific branch of study, who press with all the weight of their authority against the door which certain psychical researchers are threatening to open wide enough to admit a hitherto discredited class of facts. Such an authority-weighted door, pushing back against the weird, has also been in play for at least a century by our federal government and military. And we can only wait to see if the fuller, fairer accounting of credible military encounters with UFOs, released in June 2021 by Congress, will ever be matched by a fuller, fairer account of the credible CIA-sponsored second sight research. Specifically, the Stargate project, directed by physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, begun at Stanford University before evolving into an independent research center working out of Fort Meade in Maryland, and funded by a 25-year, $20 million contract. Unlike the aforementioned university studies, focused on accumulating statistical second sight hits, Stargate was interested in cultivating and training second sight prowess itself, beginning with their own teacher and coiner of the phrase remote viewing, Ingo Swann. And you can easily access the highly specific second sight hits of Swann and the other second sight superstars by Googling the names of Hella Hammett, Pat Price, and Joe McMonagle, or checking out Russell Targ's book, The Reality of ESP, filled with Stargate second-sighted drawings, such as Pat Price's rendering of a secret Soviet R&D facility 10,000 miles away, including his drawing on the right of a gantry crane, later revealed to have been inside it. And I agree with Pulitzer Prize finalist Annie Jacobson's assessment in her recent extensively researched history of the Stargate program, titled Phenomena, that one of the most spectacular apparent instances of extrasensory perception intelligence in the history of the program was Stargate remote viewer Gary Langford's astonishingly specific precognition of the kidnapping of General Dozier. On December 15, 1981, Langford second sighted a United States Pentagon official being kidnapped by terrorists 2 days later on the evening of December 17th. Quoting directly from Jacobson now, the information was so specific in terms of date and time, and Langford was so assertive in relaying this information, that Puthoff ran several additional sessions with him to try to learn more. Langford said he saw the terrorists breaking into this Pentagon official's apartment, binding and gagging the man, and then kidnapping him. Even more specifically, Langford saw this high-ranking official being shoved inside a trunk and secreted in the back of a van. The kidnappers were Mediterranean-looking, Langford said, and the van was blue with some kind of strange markings on the side. He drew a sketch of the truck and its dimensions. All of this played out in the exact detail that Langford foresaw, beginning with Dozier's kidnapping 2 days later on, indeed, December 17th. My own personal belief is that spontaneous, highly detailed precognitions such as this one are more persuasive than statistical anomalies of the laboratory card-guessing type. One of the most renowned such detailed precognitions is Mark Twain's dream of his brother's death, which included a rare metal coffin and a round white rose wreath with a red rose in the center, fulfilled a month later when his brother died in a steamboat explosion. Accounts are widely available. I devote a whole chapter to it in my book, and Jeffrey Kripal begins his marvelous, indeed mind-blowing book, The Flip, with it. In one sense, Twain's account of a personal second sight experience might seem a preposterous choice to emphasize. Twain was, after all, famous for his hoaxes, deliberately launched to make readers suspicious of unverified newspaper stories, such as his report about the discovery of a 300-year-old petrified man thumbing his nose. But, as I write in my book, no Twain scholar has ever suggested that Twain perpetrated a hoax here, in this horrific, deeply felt personal tragedy that, as he put it, blasted my youth and left me an old man before my time. Moreover, we know from independent family sources that he had told this dream to his sister and his mother before the fatal trip. Once fulfilled, the dream sparked Twain's lifelong interest in parapsychology. Another renowned spontaneous second sight confirmation can be found in a book I suspect many of you have read. Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. I do hope I have whetted your appetite to read Yogananda's precise fulfillment of a second sight vision of Swami Vivekananda, given to one of Yogananda's disciples when he was a boy. One of the two best collections of random second sight precognitions that I know of is that assembled by Camille Flammarion, French astronomer and one-time president of the British Society for Psychical Research. Flammarion collected 1,824 cases of precognition. You can read many of them in a book titled The Unknown, like so many books published over a century ago, available for free on Google Books. While Flammarion's name may not be known to you, his most renowned creation, a wood carving, likely is. Second sight is indeed more than just a seeing beyond the horizon, a word derived from the Greek word for boundary. Second sight is a radical reimagining of those boundaries themselves. And all of Flammarion's boundary reimagining accounts are, like the vast majority, spontaneous, along the lines of what I consider the other best collection of spontaneous second sight accounts. Investigative reporter and Newsweek editor Jess Stern's 1963 book, The Door to the Future, published 2 years before his groundbreaking and perhaps best-known work, Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation. In defense of spontaneous accounts of second sight, Stern wrote, "It was in the boundless laboratory of life, not the confining laboratory of the university, not in experimental card tricks, but the spontaneous flow of events that I hope to find the answer to the riddle of the future." For boomers, especially, who spent a lot of time at the grocery checkout counter rolling their eyes at tabloids like this, there is a very compelling chapter on the tabloid tattler herself, before she turned her prowess into a profession. Because of the extensive and all too familiar damage done to the reasoned consideration of second sight by her late career, it's worth dwelling for a few moments on her early unpaid prowess that deeply impressed the luminaries of one of the most skeptical towns in America, Washington, D.C., both its elected officials, such as Franklin Roosevelt, and its renowned reporters, including Pulitzer Prize investigative journalist Jack Anderson and Martha Roundtree, the creator of Meet the Press. It was Roundtree who got Dixon to appear on a television show with her crystal ball. Even though most of the second sight images Dixon accessed came through direct contact with people, she did often induce her second-sightedness by employing this semi-reflective prop, just as Nostradamus did with his water in a bowl, and John Dee with his obsidian mirror, on display at the British Museum. The television show, called Washington Party House, was broadcast on NBC on May 14, 1953, and featured interactions with preeminent Washington leaders. It was surely the first time someone stared into a glass ball and appear, at least in later retrospect, to have transcended time, witnessed by millions of people staring through their own curved glass that transcended space. The preeminent Washingtonian for the show that day was former Russian ambassador Joseph Davies, who asked her, "How long will Stalin's successor, Malenkov, be prime minister?" Her answer, that he would be removed in less than 2 years, was scoffed at by the ambassador, who mansplained to her that no Russian chief of state is ever replaced. He either dies like Stalin or is shot. But Dixon held her ground, and indeed, 23 months later, Malenkov was replaced. The ambassador's scoffing turned into a snort when Dixon, once again peering into her ball, ventured, "His replacement will be a portly military man with wavy hair, green eyes, and a goatee." Mansplaining again, the ambassador informed her, "I've been in Russia for years, and I never saw a Russian who looked like that," which tells us that he never saw up close what Jean Dixon saw from a distance, as indeed Malenkov's replacement was none other than portly, wavy-haired, green-eyed, goateed Marshal Bulganin. Peering again into her ball, unprompted, Dixon, her voice soaring, declared, "I see a silver ball spinning into space, coming out of the east, which leads me to believe that Russia will be the first to put a satellite into orbit," thus giving America a 4-year advance notice on what would come as a shock when Sputnik was launched in 1957. And then, apparently, Dixon continued her accurate future narrative, however tinged with symbolism, by relaying the most distinctive feature of the subsequent Russian leader, Nikita Khrushchev. "And I see the ball changing into a dove, then sinking its claws into the scalp of a completely bald man, but not drawing blood." As with most broadcasts from the early days of television, there's no surviving tape of that show, but there are other written accounts corroborating Stern's. And Stern was well aware that some, if not many, viewers who had seen the original broadcast in 1953 might well be reading his 1962 account of it. Film might still exist somewhere of an experiment conducted at the now defunct Rockland State Hospital in Orangeburg, New York, of another celebrated second sighter, Gerard Croiset, conducted by psychical researcher Lawrence Lashan. In this experiment, Croiset was filmed on June 12, 1968, in his home city of Utrecht in the Netherlands, predicting who would be sitting in what chairs at a filmed meeting at Rockland 9 days later. A full account of the experiment can be found in Lashan's book, A New Science of the Paranormal, in which he concludes, quote, "There were real and unmistakable hits that applied only to the person sitting in the chair that Croiset had specified." Like I said, the actual film may be lying in storage somewhere, and I tried reaching out to Rockland State Hospital, where Larry told me a decade and a half ago it had been stored, but I never got a reply, which is not surprising. The hospital had been abandoned decades earlier. Part of the campus, though, has been resurrected as the Rockland Psychiatric Center, so perhaps a better sleuth than me can figure out whether the film ever made it from the old building to the new. But a video does exist, on YouTube no less, of one of the best attested instances of second sight. Unlike the Dixon broadcast and the Lashan film, it's not a record of the second sight itself in advance of its occurrence, but its unimpeachable corroboration as second sight. A second sight of the deadliest plane crash in the history of the United States. On May 25, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 crashed just after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Intriguing synchronicities attended this tragic event, beginning with one of its doomed passengers, the brilliant scientist, inventor, mystic, and philosopher Itzhak Bentov. According to psychologist G. Malloy, weeks before the flight, Bentov had proposed a group-focused telekinesis experiment for that May 25th. Bentov, and I quote Malloy here, suggested that people in a variety of locations might focus their minds together to prevent a very heavy Russian satellite from falling on a populated area. It was already doomed to fall back to Earth and could cause great devastation. Bentov suggested that we use PK simultaneously to lift the object to a higher orbit, or to send it to the ocean. Beryl Payne took up the suggestion and mailed letters to a large group of people, listing the exact time for the experiment in a variety of time zones. He also announced the project on radio and TV. As the time approached for the group to focus their combined mind energy on the space object, Bentov boarded a plane from the Chicago O'Hare Airport. He was scheduled to give a workshop about his research in LA. Then, at the exact time the group began to focus on the attempt to raise the Russian object to a higher orbit, one of the engines of the plane Bentov was on dropped from the sky. The plane crashed, and all on board were killed. The tragic synchronicity of both events was shocking to all of us. His colleague, Sinella, flew to LA to conduct the workshop in memory of his friend. Yet, as sad as he was at the loss of his friend, he felt that even Bentov would understand the karmic humor of both events, and might have laughed all the way down to the crash site. Another victim with a synchronicity was author Judith Wax. She was on her way to Los Angeles to promote her new book, Starting in the Middle, about middle-aged life. Her synchronistic twist of fate can be found on page 191 of her book, the same number as the flight, where she describes her fear of flying in airplanes. Quote, "When the job required travel, I developed such a fear of airplanes, my head trembled from takeoff to landing." And as frequently attends mass public disasters, such as the Titanic or 9/11, there were accounts of vague but powerful premonitions. especially this one. Among those who were scheduled to be on board Flight 191 were Lindsay Wagner, the bionic woman, and her mother. In Wagner's own words, my mother and I were booked on that American Airlines DC-10 that crashed shortly after takeoff at the Chicago airport. But 10 minutes before we were due to get on, I had a psychic flash that warned me of disaster. I begged my mother to change our flight, and an hour later we learned that all 271 people on board had been killed. I haven't doubted a single premonition since. None of these examples, of course, would compel us to not doubt second sight. But what about this well-documented second sight vision of David Booth, filmed as part of Arthur C. Clarke's televised series on premonitions?
Everybody talks about a dream, and everybody has dreams. I didn't have a dream, I had a vision.
David Booth is still haunted today by what he lived through over 25 years ago.
The dream would always start out in the same way. It was a bright, sunlit day, and I'm looking at a very large airport and a very long runway. And there's a really large plane, and I can see American Airlines. I see the plane starting to taxi on the runway, and it gathers up speed. All of a sudden, as it's going off, there's a perception in my mind that there's something wrong with the sound that the engine is making. The plane all of a sudden seems to go almost go straight up in the air, and then it turns just like this, and then goes straight down into the ground and explodes in this humongous inferno. And then this wave of despair, just like a physical object would just hit you right in your chest. Next morning, the same thing, the same time, right in waking up. And it wouldn't stop. I've got to do something about this. What can I do about this? The only thing that I knew to do was to call the FAA. And that's what I did, fully expecting to just have the phone hung up at me.
David sounded perfectly sane and credible. There was nothing kooky about him at all. He'd had a disturbing dream 7 nights in a row. He had a problem, and I listened to him. It was my job to do that.
Every day it got worse and worse and worse. Not knowing what to do, not knowing what I was supposed to do. Not being able to forget an image seared not just into my mind, but into the very fabric of my entire being.
Well, I would talk to him and listen to him. David's dream didn't give you enough information to do anything with. It didn't give a location, it didn't give a flight, some numbers which didn't make any sense. And I said, well, thank you. There's nothing we can do about it, but thank you for the information.
May 25th, 1979. I knew I'll never have this dream again. It's going to happen soon.
On Friday morning, he called again to our Cincinnati office, and then he patched back into me and said he'd now had the dream 10 nights in a row.
Got up, went to work. I was at work for 15 minutes when the phone rang. Dave, I'm sorry to tell you, American Airlines DC-10 just crashed an hour ago on takeoff. Nobody survived.
In Chicago, taking off from O'Hare Airport, a silver American Airlines airplane that had an engine in the tail crashed, not inverted, but turning, after it passed over an abandoned hangar, a low building. It hit me as to how accurate he was. What he dreamed was, in fact, basically what happened. You've got to experience that to understand how eerie it is.
I still think about, and I always still wonder, was there anything else that I could have done? Was there anything else Jack could have done?
I don't think there's any way that David could have done any more than he did. You've got to remember, in aviation alone, there's over 20 to 25,000 flights a day by the scheduled airlines. So it's difficult to pinpoint a particular future event. In the 30 years I was with FAA, that was the only time anybody ever called in with any kind of a dream like that that I'm aware of.
I'm not the only one that these things happen to. I'm just the stupid fool that actually called the FAA before it happened.
Weird, right? Booth's persistent precognition does, of course, beg the question he himself pleadingly asks. Could it have been prevented? After all, this particular crash, later found to have been caused by a fatigue crack that developed from a mishandled maintenance engine remount a few months earlier, might well have undergone a scrupulous maintenance recheck if only Booth could have identified the exact American Airlines plane. But that would hardly make for a more comprehensible explanation of his horrific vision that led them to it. Which is not to say that there haven't been reports of accident precognitions which play out exactly as foreseen except for the accident itself. As I argued in my book, however, a dream of an accident could start out as an actual precognition, but generate an emotional reaction that shifts it out of clairvoyance to mere imagination. As Louisa Rhine put it, even if it be granted that one part of the experience, the one that was fulfilled, had been precognized, it may not be necessary to assume that the averted part was. For it is possible that the origin of the total experience was more complicated, and that the two parts had different origins. Even if the non-averted part were truly precognitive, the other still could have been a rational inference derived from the precognitive impression. One of the premier academic dream researchers, Milton Kramer, by the way, in his 2007 exploration of dreams for Routledge Press, cites Booth's repetitive dream as his first modern candidate for, quote, a possible premonitory dream. To be added to a list of persons gifted with second sight, a list so vast that doubters, said Schopenhauer, should be called not a skeptic, but an ignoramus, given all the highly credible accounts of those who directly and accurately predict future events as something existing, with complete accuracy, and with all the attendant circumstances just as they were stated, even when we had purposely made every effort to prevent it, or make the event differ, at any rate in some minor circumstance, from the communicated vision. This has always been futile, since the very thing that was to frustrate the predicted event always helped bring it about. While dreams account for many, if not most, spontaneous occurrences of second sight, many also share another source, drugs, such as the herb henbane, or Apollo's herb. Brian Murarescu, in his excellent recent history of entheogenetic plants, The Immortality Key, called henbane a psychedelic candidate for the magic at Delphi, and it also appears to have had a ritual use in Scotland as far back as the Neolithic period. It was linked with flying dreams and enhanced night vision, and also as a potent poison, as Shakespeare well knew. Though in less concentrated doses, not poured into one's ear, it can function as an anesthetic. The correlation between anesthetic drugs and second sight rituals has a rich history, traced in the West to the anesthetic gas that came to replace ether, nitrous oxide, and chloroform, ethylene. Henbane and other drugs notwithstanding, it is ethylene rising up naturally through two intersecting faults in the earth that may be the secret of Delphi, the agency of the oracle's trance, in which the future appeared to be accessed. As Diane Harris Klein, classics professor at George Washington University, put it, ethylene inhalation is a serious contender for explaining the trance and behavior of the Pythia. As for the accuracy of Delphi's second sight prophecies, see William Broad's book The Oracle for both the ethylene hypothesis and the highly compelling case to be made for the authenticity of some of the Delphic second sightings, such as specific moments in the Persian War, revising the pre-archaeological discovery critiques of classicists Joseph Fontenrose and Parkin Wormel. In our modern era, ether induced a pre-Einsteinian peak at a block universe, whose non-separation of past, present, and future most supports second sight, both pre- and retro-cognition. Scottish Nobel chemist Sir William Ramsay, under the influence of ether, wrote of feeling of recurrence, for example, table, mantelpiece, etc., having been always there. We'll return to the relation between recurrence and a having been always there block-like universe. But let us linger for now on this always having been there block universe stillness, also noted by William James's mystical coach, Benjamin Paul Blood, author of the widely distributed pamphlet, even making it so far as the Armed Forces Medical Library, The Anesthetic Revelation and the Gist of Philosophy. Speaking of the mind-blowing effect of nitrous oxide, Blood told James, "I always get a hint of the mystery when the clock stops of itself." Of course, even in a block universe, a clock stopping makes no sense unless consciousness continues running, or at least appears to be running. So as we seek to unweird a second sightable pre- and retro-cognizable universe, such as a block universe, we need to not dismiss the most prominent appearance of all, change. As oxymoronic as change might sound in a block universe, we might say that while the type of change dismissed by Father Parmenides, generation and destruction, is clearly oxymoronic in a block universe, a less substantial form of change is not. As James' greatest protege, Santayana, declared, even if the realm of truth is indeed eternal and static, there must be something akin to an exploring spirit that may traverse it without adding, removing, or changing a single feature of that indestructible labyrinth. Flux would not be abolished, but only transferred from the panorama of facts to the living spirit, which, in gradually discovering them, would be really passing through a succession of different states. All the questions concerning change, time, and existence would recur in respect to this experience and its temporal order. Santayana's thought experiment here dynamically describes Einstein's eternal and static realm of truth. In the same terms as mathematician and theoretical physicist Hermann Weyl, who summed up Einstein's block universe this way: the objective world simply is. It does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness, crawling upward along the lifeline of my body, does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space which continuously changes in time. We'll look shortly at the relation between subjective consciousness and simply is objective world. But for now, let's return to the evidence for such a non-happening world, the most pressing question raised by these altered state drug trips, and the question James posed in the last year of his life, 1910, prompted by an etherized patient's precognizing exactly what the doctors were going to say before they said it. A question, James said, not to be answered by this generation or the next. Is consciousness already there, waiting to be uncovered, and is it a veridical revelation of reality? This same question, echoing Ramsay's having been always there, is raised by a host of mind-altering substances, as our modern era knows well. Ayahuasca expert Benny Shannon, for one, says ayahuasca brings people to a realm that is above all times. Thus, from the perspective of the eternal, everything that has ever happened, as well as everything that will ever happen, all have an equal temporal status. In a certain sense, they are all there, and one only has to look at them. This, I suspect, is what is meant when the term subspecies aeternitate is invoked. A perspective is taken by which all that will have happened at all times is co-present. One most compelling drug-induced corroboration of second sight's temporal co-presence is that of the great visionary mycologist Paul Stamets, who is featured in the Netflix movie Fantastic Fungi, and whose psilocybin expertise is also featured in Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. Stamets' full account of his psilocybin-induced dream of hundreds and hundreds of floating, dead, and bloated cows, later fulfilled on the exact day the daily calendar in his dream was turned to, can be accessed live on Joe Rogan, or in Stamets' book, Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, where he writes of this second sight experience. Now I understood why the Mazatecs and Aztecs affectionately referred to psilocybes as divinatory mushrooms, genius mushrooms, and wondrous mushrooms. This single event shattered my concept of linear time. The future can be foreseen. Another drug-induced linear time shatter was recorded by the BBC, a mescaline experiment that the coiner of the word psychedelic, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, conducted with a Member of Parliament, Christopher Mayhew, in 1955. As Mayhew most memorably put it, I was not experiencing events in the normal sequence of time. I was experiencing the events of 3:30 before the events of 3 o'clock, the events of 2 after the events of 2:45, and so on. Several events I experienced with an equal degree of reality more than once. All I am saying is that I experienced them not in the familiar sequence of clock time, but in a different, apparently capricious sequence which was outside my control. And he specifically mentioned the feeling of the tea in his throat before the picking up of the cup. As it turns out, the broadcast of the experiment was never run, due to the fears of religious leaders that a profound spiritual experience was being, quote, had on the cheap. But looking back on it 30 years later, the now Lord Mayhew affirmed it as, quote, a real experience that took him beyond absolute time. Had the preeminent religious scholar Mircea Eliade been one of those religious leaders consulted, the broadcast might not only have been run, but heavily promoted. Calling Mayhew's written account of the experiment a prodigious document, Eliade said he trembled with joy when he read it, because so many of his own religious studies spoke of the possibility of abolishing time and of putting oneself into a trans-temporal condition, which this prodigious religious scholar saw as the highest good, being the dream that has most obsessed the human spirit, to coincide with the all, to recover unity, to re-establish the initial non-duality, to abolish time and creation, that is, the multiplicity and heterogeneity of the cosmos. But, as we've seen, the trembling that second sight's abolishing of time engenders is more often of fear than of joy, inducing not ecstasy and realization, but dismissal and disdain. Hence Wikipedia's claim, fostered and maintained by their so-called guerrilla skeptics in the 17th century coffeehouse pseudo-skeptic tradition, there is no scientific evidence that second sight exists. Reports of second sight are known only from anecdotal evidence given after the fact. But even those who fully accept second sight as an actuality do not thereby accept it as understandable. Altered states researcher Charles Tart, for example, knows well as anyone that precognition has so much experimental evidence attesting to its reality that no reasonable person could doubt it. But he nonetheless confesses, at some deep level, I find the idea of precognition, where the inherently unknowable future can sometimes be known, so incomprehensible that I just never think about precognition in a serious way. For many non-researchers, however, precognition's incomprehensibility is their starting and ending point to deny the phenomenon altogether. A dubious dodge. For as the 18th century Scottish minister William MacLeod, aka Theophilus in Solanus, put it, those who deny predictions by dreams, will it be a good objection against such communications that we cannot conceive the manner in which they are carried on? Can we pretend to know exactly how the union betwixt our own souls and bodies exist? One way for sure we cannot conceive how, say, the exact movements of a future plane crash, a combination of hard metal, engineering, human guidance or lack thereof, can be communicated in advance in a dream, is to enforce the strict common sense separation between matter and consciousness. When I give talks at conferences, I sometimes begin with the line, no one flew here on Mystic Airlines, or would have wanted to. Planes are solid, serious matter. We want them guided by our consciousness, not interspersed with it, well-intentioned or otherwise. And our foremost consciousness conference, the biennial Tucson Toward a Science of Consciousness, has been reinforcing the separation between subject consciousness and object matter ever since their inaugural conference in 1994, by persistently positing co-founder David Chalmers' so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness emerge from matter? This question, of course, is based on a massive assumption. An assumption not shared by the man the conference calls the father of consciousness studies, William James. James had warned about the pretense of science to penetrate ultimate questions such as the nature of consciousness by starting with what he called the leanest, lowest, aridest, bare molecular world. His colleague, Josiah Royce, summarizing James's position in a letter to him, anticipated the false start of the Tucson Consciousness Conference with its hard problem assumption. Thinkers who first make molecules and then fall down in mute and holy reverence before the awful mystery of how the molecules ever could make them, are far from knowing what it is to cross-question consciousness with any real spirit in their questioning. If I understand you, it is such cross-questioning of consciousness which you want to have done. And for contributors like me to the Tucson Conference who felt that moving toward a science of consciousness was moving away from a deeper understanding of it, a less than real spirited cross-questioning prompted their dropping the toward, as if they had at last arrived at a bona fide object of scientific inquiry, with the hard problem still in play. To be clear, there is a robust science that correlates physical brain states with consciousness. Abundant exceptions, configured under the heading neuroplasticity notwithstanding. Such correlations are the so-called easy problem. But Consciousness Conference Father James had foreseen the fundamentally flawed assumption of the contrasting hard problem with its internal consciousness without objects on one side and external objects without consciousness on the other. Consciousness, says James, evaporated to this state of pure diaphaneity, does not exist as an isolatable object of study, any more than matter without consciousness does. For a further look at the conference's foundational misunderstanding here, I invite you to check out my brief manifesto published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and subsequently reprinted online by the good folk of the annual Science and Non-Duality Conference, entitled Science and Consciousness Just Wed. Should this union be annulled? At the core of the essay is a question posed by Father James, a question so profound it resembles a koan, showing what it is to cross-question consciousness with real spirit in the questioning. How, if subject and object were separated by the whole diameter of being and had no attributes in common, could it be so hard to tell in a presented and recognized material object what part comes in through the sense organs and what part comes out of one's own head? So hard to tell is James's answer to those who still believe the dualism assumed by the hard problem is the obvious starting point for investigating reality. A reality, again, in which second sight's precise, foreseen weave of interior thoughts and external objects seems not only weird, but maximally implausible, as opposed to a reality, indeed a prime reality, which allows for precisely the kind of homogenized psychophysical world that maximizes the plausibility of second sight. A reality in which things and thoughts are not at all fundamentally heterogeneous. James depicted such a second sight-friendly, homogenized world by the phrase pure experience, and the made-up word schisness, consciousness without consciousness of self. He saw pure experience, schisness, as immediate experience in its passing, a simple that, before it is doubled into 1, a state of mind, and 2, a reality intended thereby. Schisness is the moment of the sunset before you say, how beautiful, or the sudden red flash of the cardinal at your window before you identify it as a bird, or an unexpected sound, as a revered Zen monk taught, the teaching that Alan Watts concludes his classic book, The Way of Zen, with. When Fa Chang was dying, a squirrel screeched on the roof. It's just this, he says, and nothing else. A sound as startling, yet unthreatening, as a squirrel screech bursts consciousness into the pure experience of schisness, insofar as no dualism of being represented and representing resides in the experience. All seeing, tasting, hearing, smelling, touching, thinking, imaging, feeling are reduced to the experience of that screech. If, say, you were watching TV when the squirrel screeched nearby, you could not describe the TV image that coincided with its onset. Likewise, when you bite into a particularly rich piece of chocolate, you lose the sensation of how the chocolate feels in your hand. When you see a shooting star, you stop hearing the crickets. And when the answer to a question you have been puzzling over for weeks suddenly bursts into consciousness, you lose complete contact with all external sensations. James held that schisness, pure and simple consciousness without a self-brand, was not only a reality, it was prime reality. For schisness is not distilled from the dualistic constitution of subject-object consciousness, as oil might be from pigment, but rather a dualistic constitution is added to it. Consciousness and objects have no reality, let alone prime reality, in themselves. As James's dear friend and colleague and a mentor to Jung, Theodore Flournoy, put it, schisness entails that the distinction between self and non-self, implied in the word consciousness, from which we are in a normal state unable to free ourselves, is not primary, but results from a subsequent construction, from a conceptual sorting out and classifying of the primitive experiences. He goes on to say, one can get some idea of this schisness from the fact that the mystics and some people in coming out from under the influence of anesthetics, particularly of nitrous oxide, tell of a state in which all sense of the me is abolished, and where there is nothing but the purely objective intuition of something present, the world, God, or whatever it may be. James explicitly identified this homogenized psychophysical world of schismus, consciousness without consciousness of self, with a Vedantic witness, leaving who the knower is wide open, as he says in the concluding pages of his revised psychology textbook. Today's materialist scientific consensus that all so-called matter in the universe originated from an infinitesimal dot might alone suggest that substance-less thought does not so much derive from matter as does what appears as substantive matter derives from thought. But at the very least, we can say with James that matter as something behind phenomena is a mere postulate of thought. Or, as fellow cross-questioner Royce put it, the popular assurance of an external world is the fixed determination to make one, now and henceforth. Instances of second sight argue for unfixing that determination, an unfixing that has been in play for several millennia amongst idealists in the East and even in the West. Beginning with Parmenides, the same thing exists for both thinking and being, echoed by Berkeley's "to be is to be perceived," and brought to a crescendo with James's pure experience schismus. Reluctant guide to his own deepest insights notwithstanding, James wrote, "I have not myself the least objection to idealism, a hypothesis which voluminous considerations make plausible, and whose difficulties may be cleared away any day by new discriminations and discoveries." Today's premier offerer of new discriminations and discoveries on behalf of idealism is Bernardo Kastrup, a regular columnist for Scientific American magazine and author of many books that help unfix our determination to make an external world. Books that expose the absurdity, or baloney, of a materialism consciousness divide, with consciousness being electrochemical signals unfolding in a kind of theater inside our skulls, supposedly a complex amalgam, and matter, for its part, being a reality that is an amorphous, odorless, soundless, tasteless dance of abstract electromagnetic fields devoid of all qualities of experience. And for those not disposed to let philosophers talk them literally out of their senses, consider this input from the celebrated astronomer-physicist Arthur Eddington. Seen here with Einstein, whose theory of general relativity he first confirmed with his telescope. Every time we step onto a wood floor, we are confirmed in our belief in a solid external world. But, observes Eddington, the plank has no solidity of substance. To step on it is like stepping on a swarm of flies. Shall I not slip through? No, if I make the venture, one of the flies hits me and gives a boost upward again. But if, unfortunately, I should slip through the floor, the occurrence would be not a violation of the rules of nature, but a rare coincidence. A coincidence that Robert Monroe reports encountering, lying in bed in a hypnagogic state. My fingers went through the floor, and there was the rough upper surface of the ceiling of the room below. I felt around, and there was a small triangular chip of wood, a bent nail, and some sawdust. Monroe's extraordinary experience of visceral spaciousness in the floorboards would be banned from a TED Talk today, but it nonetheless evokes one of the most popular TED Talks of all time. That of neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor, who in her TED Talk and later book recalled the first moments of a stroke she suffered in a shower. I looked down at my arm and I realized that I can no longer define the boundaries of my body. I can't define where I begin and where I end. because the atoms and the molecules of my arm blended with the atoms and molecules of the wall. And all I could detect was this energy. Energy. And a dentist turned Tibetan Buddhist whose first mastery included drilling into the hardest part of the human body with a diamond-tipped drill, has become one of our most compelling teachers of practices designed to dissolve our sense of a solid world, the solidity which defines the normal of paranormal. Tibetans, the Buddhist culture most engaged with second sight, have a practice designed to undermine the belief in the heterogeneous world of consciousness and matter that renders it most implausible. Adept at lucid dreaming, they use the illusion of the apparent waking state that one is conscious of as a dream to help them unfix what they see as the illusion of the actual waking state that separates consciousness from matter. For instance, since in a lucid dream, every apparent thing is manifestly consciousness only, there should be no problem to walk through walls. But sure enough, boing, you bang your head against the solid feeling structure. Why? Because, unlike Robert Monroe and Jill Bolte Taylor, we have never experienced walls in any other way. However much matter as something behind phenomena may be an actual illusion, we are conditioned by waking experience to believe otherwise. To uncondition ourselves from this dualistic assumption, Tibetan lucid dreamers practice walking backwards through a wall, because there is no conditioned resistance to that. Overcoming the waking state assumption of external matter solidity is not restricted to Tibetans. The primacy of consciousness, indeed timeless consciousness, is also suggested by the deepest paradoxes that the modern religion of physics invokes, and cannot account for with a dualistic materialist worldview. As the great Nobel physicist Richard Feynman put it, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. The same could be said, of course, for second sight, which is why this talk is not about trying to understand it, but only to making it less weird. And the shared weirdness of second sight and quantum mechanics may well be mitigated by the same realignment of consciousness familiar to world religions. Of quantum physics' bizarre observer effect and entanglement, physicist Amit Goswami writes, "These experiments usher a new paradigm of science based not on the primacy of matter, like the old science, but on the primacy of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of all being, which we now can recognize as what the spiritual traditions call Godhead, Christianity, Brahman, Hinduism, Ein Sof, Judaism, Shunyata, Buddhism, and so on." For those who think this renowned physicist is speaking more as a native Indian than a practicing physicist, consider quantum founding father Erwin Schrödinger's declaration, "The world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist." Or David Bohm, whose classic 1954 textbook, Quantum Theory, would later be supplanted by his 2002 non-dual theory, Wholeness in the Implicate Order, and his 2006 non-dual manifesto, The Undivided Universe, in which he declared, "Matter is turning more and more into empty space," and "Quantum field theory treats particles as quantized states of a field that extends over the whole of space." Evolving our understanding of reality from a plurality of individual units of matter, out of which a plurality of individual consciousnesses emerge, to a single field that extends over the whole of space, realigns our worldview to accommodate second sight. As Alexandra David Neal put it in her classic text, Magic and Mystery in Tibet, When one has ceased to consider oneself and others as entirely distinct entities, devoid of points of contact, then telepathy is easily practiced. Russell Targ echoes this in claiming non-dual spaciousness as the realm of both precognition and remote viewing, quoting Dzogchen Buddhist master Longchen Rabchem on incomparable timeless awareness that gives rise to everything, and so there is no other source of phenomena. Making the same point as Royce, he continues, "You are not bound by sensory experiences, but by fixation on them. Sensory appearances and consciousness of them are of one taste in non-dual unity." The East's second-citable non-dual spirituality can be seen in the foundations of Taoist mysticism, as scholar Harold Ross makes clear. For the Taoists, Shen, spiritual, entails the non-dual principle of the way or Tao, the monistic principle that pervades everything in the universe and provides humans with metaphysical knowledge such as precognition. Second-citable, non-dual monistic consciousness, promoted by physicists and mystics alike, can accommodate phenomena that common-sense dualism cannot, while accounting for common-sense dualistic perception is ultimately illusory. Common-sense dualism, however, cannot accommodate second sight. This unilateral relationship is what makes second sight a manifestation of prime reality, or what Lawrence Lashan called the clairvoyant reality. In his groundbreaking 1969 monograph, Toward a General Theory of the Paranormal, later revised and published as The Medium, the Mystic, and the Physicist, three worlds converge in what Lashan, collaborating both experimentally and theoretically with one of the most gifted and vetted psychics of the last century, Eileen Garrett, called the clairvoyant reality. The title his book was published under in the UK. Lashan introduced millions to meditation with his 1974 bestseller, How to Meditate. And the clairvoyant reality can be seen as the ultimate realization that meditation can bring, as it has for enlightened beings through millennia. While I urge you all to get a copy of The Medium, the Mystic, and the Physicist, I will share with you the 8 challenges that the clairvoyant reality makes to common sense. Challenges that are the key to making second sight less weird. 1. Individual identity is essentially illusory. 2. Information is known through the knower and object, being part of the same unitary pattern. 3. Time is without division, and past, present, and future are illusory. 4. What is, and is neither good nor evil, but a part of the totally harmonious plan of the cosmos, which, by its very being, is above good and evil. 5. Free will does not exist, since what will be is, and the beginning and end of all enfold each other. One cannot take action, but can only participate in the pattern of things. 6. Perception cannot be externally blocked, since knowledge comes from being part of the all, and nothing can come between knower and known, as they are the same. 7. Space cannot prevent information exchange between two individual objects, since their separateness and individuality are secondary to their unity and relatedness. 8. Time cannot prevent information exchange between two individual objects, since the divisions into past, present, and future are illusions. Number 5, free will does not exist, while perhaps the least controversial of the 8 challenges to common sense, may well be the one that strikes out at us closest to home. That is, the home we seem to be living in, moment by moment. However non-weird the non-reality of free will might ultimately be, surrendering belief in free will is a formidable challenge for most. Not for mystics, of course, such as Rumi. They say, what is love? Say, the abandonment of free will. He who has not escaped out of free will, no free will has he. Or prophets, such as Jeremiah. I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Or Protestants, such as Martin Luther. God foreknows nothing contingently, but foresees, purposes, and does all things according to his immutable, eternal, and infallible will. This thunderbolt throws free will flat and utterly dashes it to pieces. But for most, surrendering free will is not felt to be a viable option, even if defending it is also less viable than it may appear. In the book, The Volitional Brain Towards a Neuroscience of Free Will, I am the dissenting voice, with my article, A Variety of Religious Experience, William James and the Non-Reality of Free Will, based largely on James's still widely read masterpiece, The Principles of Psychology. While the details of James's disavowal of free will on psychological grounds are beyond the scope of this talk, I will mention the key interplay brought to his attention by his fellow MD philosopher Rudolf Hermann Lotz. That is, the interplay between the passive incoming or afferent feeling of effort being registered and the equally passive outgoing or efferent feeling of effort being made. Passive because what we believe to be acts of will and effort expressed through our movements are all automatic responses to arising stimuli, thoughts and feelings of unascertainable origin. Einstein is perhaps the most noteworthy of prominent theorists who reject free will, and his renowned photon entanglement thought experiment, known as the EPR paradox, accused quantum theory's foundational indeterminism as promoting an untenable, what he called spooky action at a distance. And even though Einstein's quantum thought experiment morphed into an actual quantum experiment that seemed to establish such indeterminate, spooky action, the experiment was only made possible by the essential theoretical assist of physicist John Stuart Bell, who dismissed it as proof of quantum indeterminism, affirming the possibility of its opposite. In his own words, a way to escape the inference of spooky action at a distance involves absolute determinism in the universe, the complete absence of free will. Bell's absolute deterministic, or what he himself called a super-deterministic explanation of the experimental results, has been in play among physicists ever since, especially recently. As physicist Tim Anderson put it, superdeterminism implies that there are correlations that are built into the structure of the universe that vanish when quantum effects can be neglected. It posits a universe much like Einstein's general relativistic one, a predetermined four-dimensional structure where particles and the experiments measuring them are frozen in time like flies in amber. And, as philosopher Richard Double long ago observed, the question of why quantum indeterminacies should occur just when we manifest libertarian free will strikes me as unanswerable. But free will and a belief in independent agency are, of course, not readily surrendered, even amongst those most supportive of the reality of precognition. While Einstein not only had no problem with, but actually took deep solace in the non-reality of free will, others who equally suspect the strict linear relationship between past, present, future, such as Darrell Bem, are not ready to let go of causal agency just because future effects can manifest before their necessarily preceding causes. Rather than surrender to an acausal but radically synchronistic block universe, they argue for a second temporal causal pathway, future to present. I find retrocausation to be of no help in making precognition less weird, far preferring what one of its biggest supporters, Eric Wargo, in his book Time Loops, derides as the alternative to retrocausation, the vague acausal fog of synchronicity offered as a compromise by Carl Jung. Jung's synchronicity, whose first stimulus, he said, came from a series of dinners he had with Einstein, and which he later developed with another giant of physics, Wolfgang Pauli, is only foggy when it is compromised, when woven together with causality, as here in Jung's joint schema with Pauli. As Arthur Koestler fairly observed, Jung offers no concrete explanations how the schema is meant to work, and his comments on it are obscure. Uncompromised synchronicity, however, as Schopenhauer said of all forms of clairvoyance, is an ultimate reality, a reality he identified with Kant's noumena, rendering our common sense experience of space, time, and causality as appearance only, Kant's phenomena. And therefore, synchronicity, like second sight, can be understood only metaphysically. Physically, it is an impossibility. Insofar as retrocausal explanations of second sight and synchronicity try to preserve the appearance of causality, their compromise is also a foggy mix. But there is strong reason to believe that Jung did not ultimately promote this mix. In Jung's own words, it is impossible with our present resources to explain ESP, or the fact of meaningful coincidence as a phenomenon of energy. This makes an end of causal explanation as well, for effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity. Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation. Jung, by the way, was profoundly influenced by James and spent 2 evenings with him, mostly discussing parapsychology and the psychology of religious experience, or what Jung, in his introduction to Anila Jaffe's book, Apparitions and Precognition, called strange tales that, because they incur the odium of superstition, are generally exchanged only in secret. For a brilliant accounting of why Jung's Parmenidean Einsteinian block universe version of synchronicity has been a secret encouraged by generations of Jungians, I once again recommend Peter Kingsley, whose recent book on Jung, entitled Catafalque, reads like a commentary on these words of Jung in radical defense of his deepest insight. The latest comment about synchronicity is that it cannot be accepted because it shakes the security of our scientific foundations, as if this were not exactly the goal I am aiming at. See also Alan Combs and Mark Holland's delightful book, Synchronicity, which preserves Jung's radical vision of synchronicity rooted in the unus mundus, one world, a level of reality which, like Bohm's implicate order, forms a common foundation for both mental and physical existence. Synchronicity, second sight, and Bohm's implicate, literally folded-in order constitute a holy trinity of sorts, as we shall later see when we look at Plotinus's folding and unfolding one. A trinity formed from the same denial of causality as Jung's uncompromised synchronicity. As Bohm's collaborator and biographer F. David Peat writes in his Synchronicity book, in building the bridge between mind and matter, the notion of causality must be bypassed in favor of transformations and unfoldings. Bypassing causality, a key to accommodating second sight, has been sanctionable in the West since David Hume's groundbreaking challenge to causality's common-sense existence. That no matter how many times one event follows another, custom, overwhelmingly witnessed custom, as yet to be seen as otherwise custom, is all you've definitively got, not cause and effect. Hume's challenge may well have been discussed by James and Jung in their evening together, sharing strange tales in secret. Jung, in full agreement with Hume, spoke of the merely statistical nature of causality, and James went further, asserting, "The word cause is an altar to an unknown God, an empty pedestal still marking the place of a hoped-for statue." Hume's dismantling of causality earned him Isaiah Berlin's high praise, "No man has influenced the history of philosophy to a deeper or more disturbing degree." But Western philosophy's deepest disturbance is Eastern religion's supremest peace. As Vivekananda affirms, the very idea of causation exists only in the phenomenal world. A Sanskrit term, kakataliya, from kaka, crow, and taliya, palm tree, refers to a coconut's falling from a tree just after a crow alights on its branch. In the classic Hindu text, Vasistha's Yoga, a book which Muktananda called like nectar for aspirants of the highest beatitude, all apparent causality is kakataliya. As Hume, James, and Jung would agree, neither the succession of bird alighting, coconut falling, or any other succession entails causal doing, except for the ignorant caught up in this cause and effect tangle or deluded notion that causality is inviolably real. In Eastern texts that explicitly acknowledge the reality of second sight, like the last two classic texts we invoked, can be found an explicit, even emphatic acknowledgement of the non-reality of causation. Hence, the Vasistha's Yoga, even though all seems to happen, there is no creation. The one infinite consciousness alone is thought form or experience. There is no cause and effect relationship. These cause and effect are only words, not facts. Or in Longchen Rabjam's, in naturally occurring timeless awareness, the ultimate heart essence, there is no causality. As Russell Targ summed up the ultimate peace of such timeless awareness in his book Limitless Mind, our peaceful mind can learn to reside outside of time, in a place free of depression about the past, anxiety about the future, or fear of the present. Such ultimate peace, weird as it might sound to Western ears, is not a peace that surpasseth the understanding of two of its most influential thinkers, Parmenides and Einstein, but it does require us to shift from causal doers to acausal arrivers. The esteemed relativity philosopher Adolf Grunbaum, for whom time is non-objective and no more independent of perception than color, put it this way: coming into being is only coming into present awareness. Reducing both subjective and objective being to present awareness is the very stuff of dreams, which nightly simulate a subject-object dualistic world, only later realized to have been non-dual consciousness coming into present awareness. As James says, if I dream of a golden mountain, it no doubt does not exist outside of the dream. But in the dream, the mountain is of a perfectly physical nature or essence. It is as physical that it appears to me. And since, as James goes on to say, hallucinations, illusions, dreams feel just like reality until you wake from them, why may not the whole world be a dream from which we haven't awakened? That the apparent myriad plurality of the whole waking world might actually be the same single-sourced monism as a dream, in which all apparent outer manifestations inhere, has been the prime insight of Eastern sages for millennia, such as the Taoist Chuang-Tzu, who asked the same question in his famous butterfly dream. A dream's single-sourced monism may be more than analogous to the single-sourced monism that James identifies as the great mystic achievement of Tat Thamasi, that thou art. Not a part, not a mode of that, but identically that absolute spirit of the world. Michael Talbot concludes his holographic universe by identifying ultimate reality with this same indivisible totality of realized Hindu masters, the dream of Brahman. Masters like Lahiri Mahasaya, the guru of Sri Yukteswar, there in the upper left-hand corner, who was in turn the guru of Paramahansa Yogananda, to whom Yukteswar revealed his master's deepest secret. My guru knew this world to be nothing but an objectivized dream. The match between Mahasaya's sublime belief and his sublime gaze is shared by Ramana Maharshi, who famously said, "Waking is long and a dream short. Other than this, there is no difference." The sublime gaze of those who share this monistic belief and the second sight phenomena it supports is not shared by anyone who doubles down on common sense, concrete existence. Though in fairness to Mr. Morgan's appreciation for second sight support systems, he did say, millionaires don't use astrology. Billionaires do. But even if we prefer Maharshi's enlightenment to Morgan's billions, we may well resist converting the manifold waking world into a single-sourced monism, dream or otherwise, aligning instead with Bertrand Russell, who asserted, "I share the common sense belief that there are many separate things. I do not regard the apparent multiplicity of the world as consisting merely in phases and unreal divisions of a single indivisible reality." James mostly shared this same common sense belief, except, as we shall see, when he came to consider the non-dual, consciousness-only, indivisible reality of second sight. Though non-duality is not an obliteration of differences, as Arthur Osborne makes clear in his sadly neglected 1961 book, The Future is Now. All differences, he writes, have their existence, yet are drenched in the unity of some deeper aspect. This deeper aspect unity of differences is a commonplace of mystical experiences, such as one related by a friend of Osborne's. Each blade of grass was lit from within and gave forth an essence of enchantment, harmonizing with heightened beauty in everything around me. The familiar mystical experience of everything being lit with a peculiar beauty is a trap door that drops one from the common sense of objective multiplicity. As Osborne's friend elaborates, it was as if some unknown alchemy had been at work, blending and uniting all with my own being. Light, the sibling of consciousness, is both experienced as an alchemically deeper aspect of an unchanging unity and our best metaphor for it. As the poet Shelley, who had a powerful precognition that shook him to his core, put it, life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. And Altered States researcher James accepted this as not only unweird, but plausible, writing, "Suppose now that this were really so," and then wrote, "The world of natural experience may be just a time mask, shattering or refracting the one infinite thought, which is the sole reality, into those millions of finite streams of consciousness known to us as our private selves. The refraction of one eternal, infinite thought into a multiplicity of finite streams of individual thinking is not contradicted by our assumption of personal thought creation. For, as James points out in the Principles of Psychology, it is only an assumption. As he puts it, if we could say it thinks the way we say it rains, we would be speaking with a minimum of assumption. And the minimally assumed impersonal thinking in all of us, James further allows, may well be single-sourced. As he puts it, for my own part, I confess that the moment I become metaphysical, I find the notion of some sort of an anima mundi, world soul, thinking in all of us, to be a more promising hypothesis, in spite of all its difficulties, than that of a lot of absolutely individual souls. But whatever the source, the coming into present awareness of each thought is simultaneously the coming into being of the thinker, as James, practically quoting the non-dual sage Shankara, claims as a fundamental principle of psychology. The passing thought is itself the thinker, and psychology need not look beyond. This radical non-dual coming into present awareness emerges not from what James's friend Vivekananda called the assumed individuality delusion, but rather from a gap that gives more support for James's proposition of schismus as prime reality, and, as we saw earlier, leaving who the knower is wide open. The gap between thoughts, though elusive, is nonetheless omnipresent. As Krishnamurti put it, though the response, the movement of thought, seems so swift, there are gaps. There are intervals between thoughts. Between two thoughts there is a period of silence which is not related to the thought process. While EEGs confirm these gaps in all brain states, they are most obvious in the slowed down theta state. And thus it comes as no surprise, as Zen neuroscientist James Austin points out, that topographic EEG mapping methods confirm that theta predominates during Zazen. Serious Zen student Basho created a form of poetry, haiku, to highlight this gap. Old pond, frog jumps in, sound of the water. In his groundbreaking book, Non-Duality, David Loy shares two drawings made for him by a Buddhist monk in Thailand, illustrating the fundamental realization of this gap. The first drawing represents our common sense feeling that between one thought and another, a new thought cannot emerge unless it is linked with the previous thought. The second, the realization that such linking is a delusion. As Loy puts it, thoughts do not arise from each other, but by themselves. James, who early on saw consciousness as a stream, late in life came round to this same realization that, as he put it, all our sensible experience, as we get them immediately, change by discrete pulses of perception. Discrete pulses is also the first key to the anesthetic revelation, as set forth by Benjamin Blood's fellow ethernaut, Xenos Clark, that Blood shared in a letter to James. The succession is the thing. Nor is succession just the thing for Zen monks, chemically induced experiencers of theta states of consciousness, or philosophers with keen psychological insight. Succession is the key as well to the sibling relationship between consciousness and light. James, in the Principles of Psychology, quotes his goldmine of insights, Shadworth Hodgson, on the minimum of assumption of consciousness, a sequence of difference. And Einstein, in the sentence that astrophysicist John Gribben called the true beginning of the quantum revolution, revealed the energy of a beam of light emanating from a certain point is not distributed continuously in an ever-increasing volume, but is made up of a finite number of indivisible quanta of energy that are absorbed or emitted only as wholes. This same gap-ridden sequencing of individuated wholes, as the eminent neuropsychologist Jason Brown makes clear, even underlies apparently motionless solid objects. In order for an object to exist as a solid, writes Brown, it must recur over successive durations. This is true for all perceptions, though it is more emphatic in some modalities than others. It may not be obvious that a tree, like any visual object, must be perceived over a succession of occasions for it to be perceived at all. How the precise future of a seemingly solid, consciousness-less substance, like an airplane, manifests in a second-sighted dream 10 nights in a row, becomes less weird to contemplate when we understand, with James, that all that the word substance means is the fact that certain perceptual experiences do seem to belong together. Substance means that a definite group of sensations will recur. The discontinuity underlying the apparent fixed continuity of anything we identify as substance or matter applies as well to what we identify as continuous motion. As Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of DNA, who launched a second career looking for the foundation of consciousness, concluded, after years of painstaking research with neuroscientist Christoph Koch, all movements of visual consciousness are derivable from discrete, static snapshots, like a strip of movie film. Edward Muybridge's groundbreaking photography a century and a half ago suggested as much. The weirdness of second sight, with apparently pre-existing moments waiting to be uncovered, is indeed made less weird by its analogy with film, the supreme reality simulator of our times. While Oliver Sacks speculated, we may find movies convincing precisely because we ourselves break up time and reality, much as a movie camera does, into discrete frames, which we then reassemble into an apparently continuous flow. Reality as an apparent continuous flow of static frames need not be generated by individuated eyes, but may rather be just moment by successive moment of one timeless film, with frames pre-linked in what James called the continuity of adjacents, a continuity in which self-transcendency is everywhere denied. Instead of it, and performing the same function, we have the continuity of adjacents. And while James held it is clear that too much attention cannot be brought to bear upon this notion, a self-transcending continuity of adjacency has little appeal for those who feel the continuity of one moment of consciousness to the next very much entails self-agency. As Jason Brown put it, the world might be a film strip that comes into awareness as it unreels, but the individual feels the future is open, and that the self is positioned at the forward edge of change. James himself wanted a dynamic, forward-leaning self on the edge of change to be real. But not only, as we saw, did he identify the thinker with the passing thought, and, like the Buddhists, each passing thought as its own discrete pulse, he also identified the future-feeling edge of change as part of a specious present, what Buddhists see as a delusional entanglement between past and future, posing as the present, obscuring the self-transcendent now-only moments arising in between gaps. What feels like the self positioned at the edge of change is actually the formation of the feeling of self itself, a combination of future feeling anticipating and past feeling receding, however much it is experienced as a single unit of feeling, as in James's metaphor, the front and back of a saddle. Or in Blood's metaphor, the simultaneous front-back pressure of a chimney sweep. The future and the past, insofar as they exist at all, only exist, like the existence of everything, as now present moments. But, as I write in my book, the past and the future are most commonly experienced as a distraction, literally a pulling apart from the now into a temporal landscape of distances, literally a standing apart. This other than the ever-present now distracted consciousness is the palpitating inward life of self, a moment of, or movement into, a feeling of time, away from the timeless infinite feeling of schisness, consciousness without consciousness of self, which is not only without temporal borders, but without any I positioning here now to which such borders can refer. Neither the past nor future exist as actual alternatives to the present. They exist rather as the imaginary temporal landscape that the I reverberates as. But whether it be a real present now moment of consciousness, as in schisness, or a specious present now moment of consciousness, consciousness with self, all moments of consciousness are assimilatable into the self-transcending continuity of adjacents. John McTaggart, noting that all mysticism denies the reality of time, made a still hotly debated claim that the very concept of time requires two simultaneous concepts, an A series of past, present, future, and a B series of before and after, that are, however, incompatible with each other. In addition, he promoted a C series, or permanent relation of terms, a continuity of adjacents that define an order, though not a direction, such as MNOP rather than MONP or ONMP, or in any other possible order. Physicist Julian Barber promoted this same permanent relation of terms in a continuity of adjacents. In his groundbreaking book, The End of Time, The Next Revolution in Physics, Barber, like Sachs, invoked a universe of simultaneously placed images that can be played out as in a movie, an ultimate reality that Jason Brown concisely characterized, though didn't adopt, as serialized in situ, in place, prior to actualization. This film strip-like fixity of McTaggart's C-series continuity of adjacents has been in play for both philosophers and physicists since 1908. The year that Einstein's math teacher Minkowski, ahead of Einstein himself, conceived and coined the block universe concept space-time, and McTaggart published his book The Unreality of Time, which has remained integral to timelessness speculation ever since, as again exemplified by Julian Barber. Change merely creates an illusion of time, with each individual moment existing in its own right, complete and whole. Whether or not this does indeed prove to be the next revolution in physics, it's hardly a fringe view anymore. As one of our most lucid and widely read physicists, Sean Carroll, put it, I find the eternalist block universe to be perfectly acceptable. Perfectly acceptable is a stretch for many, though, even those who do not seek to overturn Einstein's affirmation of the illusion of separation between past, present, and future. But one way to increase its acceptability, I believe, is to shed the shape that the world block most readily conjures, and consider it as applying to a sphere or circle, the Sanskrit word for which is mandala. Einstein's conception of the universe as a whole was, in physicist-astronomer Marcello Gleiser's summation, a static, spherical, perfectly symmetric cosmos, with matter homogeneously distributed everywhere, reflecting a mix of Platonic perfection and of Occam's razor. And while this spherical conception has been seriously challenged by evidence in support of an open, flat universe, support for Einstein's perfectly symmetrical sphere has emerged a century after he proposed it, published in the esteemed journal Nature Astronomy, and summarized here by the British tabloid The Sun. While material-based science evolves its understanding of the shape of the universe, with no regard for the timelessness essence of Einstein's space-time, Einstein's mandala-esque vision connects him with two other great Western sages. His nickname inspiration, Parmenides, also imagined the universe as a sphere, writing, "What is utterly unchanging, complete on every side, like the bulk of a well-rounded sphere, from a center point equally matched everywhere." And the circle dot, representing the monad, a Greek word meaning solitary unit, was conceived by the Pythagoreans and later Greeks as the absolute or prime metaphysical being. Conceiving the block universe as round, a circle, or that which consists entirely of circles, a sphere, gives us a context for a second sight that necessarily transcends a materialistic cosmology. It begins with an appreciation of the ultimate beauty of this context, as seen by Pythagoras, who held that the most beautiful figure is the sphere among solids and the circle among plane figures. And more than mere beauty, Pythagoras saw the circle as sacred, which helps solve the mystery, I believe, of why Pythagoras drew attention to the special sacred quality of the leaves of a mallow plant. Peter doesn't tell us why, but it may well have had something to do with the mallow plant's unusual round shape. As his main biographer, Iamblichus, tells us, the mallow plant for Pythagoras is the first sign of the sympathy between heavenly and earthly beings. And surely that is enough to qualify its round shape, radiating out from a center point, as divine symbolism, specifically the divine symbolism of the absolute monad. The mutually sympathetic, indeed defining relationship between a center point, also called a circumpunct, and its circumference, makes it the supreme symbol of the absolute, especially the absolute as God, as conceived by a 12th century anonymous philosopher in the famous and widely attributed phrase, "God is a sphere, whose center is everywhere, and circumference nowhere," which I take to mean, God is a sphere, whose center is everywhere, and circumference no identifiable somewhere. The Greeks, including the pre-Socratics, Plato, the Neoplatonists, and the Eastern Orthodox Church Fathers, readily conceived of divinity as circular. A timeless center point, informing all the myriad temporal points on the circumference, simultaneously facilitates our ability to conceive both second sight and a relationship between God and man, whether the Christian God the Father, as that of the 6th century Greek saint Dorotheus of Gaza, who wrote, "Imagine a circle, in the middle, its center, and radii or rays going out of this center. Imagine now that this circle is the world, the very middle of it God, and the straight lines radii going out from the center towards the circumference, or going from the circumference towards the center, are the paths of men's lives." Or as a more abstract divinity, as in Plotinus's center-pointed radiating one, in which what the center is like is revealed through the radii, unfolded, as it were, without being unfolded. And note how seamlessly Plotinus's center-pointed radiating one fits not only Parmenides' sphere, but the non-anthropomorphic god of Pythagoras' contemporary Xenophanes, his greatest amongst gods, who is not at all like mortals in body or in thought, who whole he sees, whole he thinks, and whole he hears. And as a center point revealed through radii, unfolded without being unfolded, always he abides in the same place, not moving at all, nor is it seemly for him to travel to different places at different times. Plotinus is his phrase for the relation between the center point and the center, unfolded as it were without being unfolded, would be echoed by David Bohm's time is an unfoldment of the timeless order. Bohm identified the prime ordering of the universe as implicate, from the Latin word implicatus, folded in, with the apparent manifest world being the explicate order, or folded out. Bohm used two metaphors to explain the interplay between a folding in and a folding out, both illustrated here on the cover of the Spanish edition of his book. The orange figure represents Bohm's metaphor of a dot of ink dropped into a glycerin solution, which is then rotated so that the dot spreads out, but, when reverse rotated, collects back to its precise size and starting point. The second is the diffraction pattern of a holographic plate that functions as the implicate order for the manifest world of apparent 3D objects in a hologram. Both images, culminating metaphors for Bohm, indicate what Bohm called projections of a single totality. Projections of a single totality, particularly the totality of Plotinus's center-pointed radiating one, not only seamlessly fits James's second sight-friendly suggestion of consciousness already there waiting to be uncovered, James invokes this mystic mandala himself, asking, like the windrows on a compass, may not we ourselves form the margin of some more really central self in things which is co-conscious with the whole of us? May not you and I be confluent in a higher consciousness, though we now know it not? Any continuity, let alone causality, between adjacent points on the circumference are derived solely from the relation to the shared center point, not from a direct line between the points themselves, for there are no lines in a circle. No line connects one circumferal point to another. A line, called a tangent, can only intersect with one point on the circumference. And given that all individual circumferal points share the same foundational center point, second sight becomes more plausible, not only as a revelation of what is to come or has transpired, but as an ultimate spiritual revelation itself, revealing the source informing all thoughts, past, present, and future. As Jason Brown put it, oneness is not the coming together of God and mystic, but the reaching down to the foundation of thought before the surfacing of individuality. To the degree that the surfacing of individuality is felt to be on a linear path, we are treading a tangent line, disconnected from the foundation of thought. To glimpse what pre-I formation, foundational thought sourcing might be like, consider Walt Whitman. Each moment, and whatever happens, thrills me with joy. One and all are to me miracles, the whole referring, yet each distinct and in its place. To me, every hour of the light and dark is a miracle. Becoming identified with the source of moments, reaching down to the foundation of thought before the surfacing of individuality, Whitman loses the sense of surface agency without losing the sense of the surface itself. The whole referring, yet each distinct and in its place, is repeatedly stated. The universe is duly in order. Everything is in its place. What has arrived is in its place, and what waits is in its place. Everything can be said to be in its place only if everything participates in a discernible whole whose configuration is in no danger of being altered by its parts. James's Windrow's mystical suggestion fits this scenario, as does Whitman's more abstract configuration of the simple, compact, well-joined scheme. Myself disintegrated, everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme. The Einstein-Parmenides block universe mandala compels us to consider, with Whitman, that everything is indeed in its place, what has arrived and what waits, corroborating James's mystical suggestion of consciousness already there, waiting to be uncovered as a veridical revelation of reality, and that therefore the confluently active radii of his windrows become confluently activated radial endpoints, serialized in place prior to activation. The one consciousness, already there, being uncovered, is divided functionally into the knowing and the known, with the knowing center point eternally activating the known circumference, as in the well-known five phenomenon, mostly now known as a symbol of frustration, but what James noted in the varieties of religious experience as the second key to the anesthetic revelation, quoting Xenos Clark, the formula by which the now keeps exfoliating out of itself, yet never escapes. The truth is that we travel on a journey that was accomplished before we set out. In keeping with Santayana's hypothesized eternal and static realm of truth, traversed by an exploring spirit, a recurring circular cosmic path, known as eternal recurrence, has been acknowledged east and west for millennia. And since a circular path more readily accommodates second sight than a linear one, we do well to consider it here. Although a fixed cyclical cosmology is more identified with the East, as depicted in this calm dance of the primal god Shiva, or in what some interpret as the key to the Tao or way of Lao Tzu, a universal spherical vortex, explicit eternal recurrence or return has vital roots in the West, especially along the Atlantic front, connecting Greek and Celtic culture. As scholar Pierre Brunel affirms, the fundamental Celtic myth is characterized by the theory of the eternal return, according to which time progresses in a cyclical manner, so that events recur in an identical form in those that the original cycle follow, beginning again and again exactly as they did the first time. And for the Greek masters of masters, with whom eternal recurrence is first identified, this myth was real. If one may believe the Pythagoreans, said Aristotle's pupil Eodemus, considered the first historian of science, the same things will recur exactly, and I shall be holding my pointer and talking to you as you sit there, and everything else will be exactly as it is now. Although we know that Pythagoras was aware of the Celts and the Celts of Pythagoras, there are competing claims for whom might have influenced whom. And any consideration of this Greek origin of the eternal recurrence does well to recall Peter Kingsley's claim that Pythagoras was a collector of traditions, which leaves us various candidates for where he might have accessed this ancient cosmology beyond the Celtic North or Hyperborea. Having lived his first 4 decades on Samos, he may well have gotten wind of it from Babylon, as represented here in those dandelion-esque details of Ishtar's gate. Then again, his first stop upon leaving Samos was to study with priests in Egypt, where eternal recurrence, whether represented by the actual scarab beetle or the imagined Ouroboros, was an Egyptian belief, establishing, as Egyptian scholar Rosalie Davis put it, the coexistence of stasis and change. The same Ouroboros, as Jung noted, which is the primal symbol of alchemical truth, as well as the framing symbol of the Theosophical Society. And then there is the Silk Road influence of India on the Eastern Greeks, emphasized by Kingsley, especially those, like Pythagoras, who later became the Western Greeks, having emigrated to Sicily. So Pythagoras may well have been exposed to the recurring Vedantic notion of eternal recurrence, as expressed, for example, by the Indian sage most responsible for bringing the Vedas to the West, Swami Vivekananda, who told a New York audience in 1896, "All the forms we are seeing now have been manifested again and again, and the world in which we live has been here many times before." And then, practically quoting Eudemus's account of the Pythagoreans, said, "I have been here and talked to you many times before. The very words that you have been listening to now, you have heard many times before, and many times more it will be the same." Contemporaneously with Vivekananda, a German professor of Greek was speaking the same exact message, doubling down on the minutest details of eternal recurrence. What if, some day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness, and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself." Weird. Yet not at all a weird fit for second sight, nor for ultimate reality, the absolute or God, beyond good and evil and without a goal, unless the joy of the circle is itself the goal. Nietzsche, after all, most famous for his declaration that God is dead, saw his circular cosmology as a plausible resurrection. And while many, Nietzsche knew, would see the demon as conveying a throw-yourself-down, teeth-gnashing curse, Nietzsche himself experienced the realization as a tremendous moment of spiritual insight. One of those who, as he said, would declaim, "You are a God, and never have I heard anything more divine." But alas, for the cultural viability of this second citable belief, so suited to the relativity physics born 5 years after Nietzsche died. The early church fathers, for whom eternal recurrence was not a philosopher's mystical suggestion, but a lived pagan belief they saw as hostile to Christianity, could think of nothing less divine. Especially St. Augustine, who fiercely denounced, quote, "those arguments with which the ungodly try to turn our simple piety from the straight road, and to make us join them in walking in circles. God forbid, I say, that we should swallow such nonsense. Christ died, once and for all, for our sins, and in rising from the dead, he is never to die again. He is no longer under the sway of death." But this banning of the crucifixion from eternal recurrence, and thereby herding all of us into a linear-only path to salvation, is more pleading than reasoning. After all, may not the Celtic cross, whose origin is obscure, reflect the fundamental Celtic myth of eternal recurrence? Of course, Christian resistance to pagan eternal recurrence did not begin with the Church Fathers. It coheres well with the Old Testament, out of which it evolved. Judaism emphasized, if not introduced, linearity with "Abraham went forth." As Thomas Cahill explains, for the Jews, history is always something new. The future will not be what has happened before. However inconvenient Ecclesiastes 1:9 is to that belief. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Cahill says the main gift of the Jews was free will, but as I am fond of pointing out, the two most prominent Jewish thinkers, Spinoza and Einstein, tried to give it back. And while the Judeo-Christian tradition has also rejected reincarnation, it's worth noting that both the Pythagoreans and the Celts embraced it. For combined with belief in prophecy, which the Judeo-Christian tradition does embrace, Reincarnation enables eternal recurrence to play out as the individual narrative lines of myriad lives within the aesthetic whole of a completed cyclical novel, the story of the universe. What the great 17th century essayist Joseph Addison concluded in relating second sight to God as supreme author, that being who disposes of events and governs futurity, applies as well to God the Circle, in an eternally recurring universe with reincarnational continuity. The circle whose center sees at one view the whole thread of my existence, not only that part of it which I have already passed through, but that which runs forward into all the depths of eternity, with evils that threaten me averted or turned to my advantage. But perhaps second sightable circularity is re-emerging, and not a moment too soon. According to Jung, UFOs may be a projection of a psychic content of wholeness that has at all times been symbolized by the circle, and therefore an attempt by the unconscious collective psyche to heal the split in our apocalyptic age by means of the symbol of the circle. And finally, this. Just before COVID came to town, the Guggenheim had its best attended show ever, the channeled art of Hilma af Klint, painted by her in the first 2 decades of the last century. She says her hand was guided by a higher spirit, who informed her that her work was to be shown in a temple, though what that temple would be was not indicated, other than it would be a, quote, circular building where viewers would ascend a spiral path towards the sky. When this vision, recorded decades before the museum came into existence, even as an idea, was shared with the audience of the symposium held on the opening of the exhibition, an audible gasp was heard throughout the Guggenheim Auditorium. And, as frequently attends revelations of nonlinear time, perhaps even more than one, "Oh my God."